Hello, welcome to a virtual event by the Atlantic Council. My name is William Wexler. I lead the Atlantic Council's work on the Middle East, and we're here to discuss the growing set tensions between the United States and Iran and the hostilities that we've seen recently in Iraq. This event is brought to you by the Atlantic Council's Iraq Initiative and its Future of Iran Initiative. Just want to remind everyone that this event is being recorded, it's being streamed live, and it's on the record. If anybody out there wants to social media, you can use hashtag ACIran and hashtag ACIraq. After our panelists make some brief opening remarks, we'll open the floor for questions and answers. The audience can submit questions in three ways. You can email Stephanie Hauser-Ali at shauser@atlanticcouncil.org, the email that's on the invitation, or by typing them into the chat box on your screens, or by digitally raising their hands. We will try to answer as many questions as we can. I will call on participants who submit questions, and then we will unmute you so that you can ask your question. At the beginning of this year, the world was transfixed by the lethal attacks on Americans in Iraq by Iranian-backed forces and the cycle of escalation that resulted eventually in President Trump's decision to kill Qasem Soleimani. Now, with far less fanfare, that cycle is returning. Last Wednesday, 2 Americans and a British national were killed in a rocket attack against an Iraqi base. The next day, the Pentagon launched airstrikes in retaliation. And since there have been a series of additional strikes by both sides. There's been an announcement of another round of U.S. sanctions. There's been redeployment of some U.S. forces out of certain Iraqi bases. Iran is clearly trying to force an American withdrawal, and the U.S. is trying to protect its interests and reinforce its red lines. Yesterday, NBC News reported that President Trump canceled a wider U.S. military response to Iranian-backed attacks in Iraq because of the coronavirus. He was reportedly concerned that hitting back hard at Iran at this time, while the rest of the world, including Iran, were struggling to contain the spread of the coronavirus, would make the U.S. look bad. And meanwhile, caught in the middle, once again, Iraq is simultaneously confronting a security crisis, a health emergency, an economic freefall, all without the benefit of a functioning government in Baghdad. We have 4 people, experts from the Atlantic Council, here to discuss this with this audience. First, and I'm going to go to each in turn, but let me introduce them all at once. First, Dr. Abbas Khatam. He leads the Atlantic Council's Iraq Initiative. Before that, he was a senior foreign policy fellow at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, and formerly an assistant professor at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, and a visiting assistant professor at Stanford. He is the author of Reclaiming Iraq, the 1920 Revolution and the Founding of the Modern State. Abbas will speak to us about what's happening in Iraq and what the various actors in Iraq will likely do. Barbara Slavin, who will then talk after Abbas, directs the Future of Iran Initiative here at the Atlantic Council. She's a career journalist. She previously served in senior positions at the Washington Times, USA Today, The Economist, and the New York Times Week in Review. And she is the author of Bitter Friends, Bosom Enemies, Iran, the U.S., and the Twisted Path to Confrontation. She'll tell us about how these recent events are being perceived in Iran and offer some predictions about the next step the authorities in Tehran might take. Kirsten Fontenrose is director of our Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative. She has 20 years of experience from positions within the U.S. Department of Defense, the Department of State, the White House, private industry, and the nonprofit sector, all focused on the Middle East. Her last job in government was at the National Security Council staff, where she served as senior director for Gulf Affairs when H.R. McMaster was the national security advisor. She will explain to us how the Trump administration is thinking about these rising tensions and give some thoughts about how it's looking forward to, further reinforcing American deterrence and protecting U.S. interests. And finally, but not least, Tom Warwick is a senior fellow here with the Middle East programs at the Atlantic Council. Prior to joining us, for over a decade, from 2008 to 2019, he was the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Counterterrorism Policy at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, where he was also DHS's leading expert on Iran. Before going to DHS, Tom worked at the State Department, where during the George W. Bush administration, he served in Baghdad and also led state's famous Future of Iraq project that was unfortunately ignored by the Pentagon after the invasion. Tom will offer his thoughts on the combinations and sometimes contradictions of U.S. objectives with Iran and with Iraq. If you go to atlanticcouncil.org, you'll find the full biographies of all four of today's speakers, as well as a list of more recent publications that each one of them has done. You'll also find our latest post on our New Atlanticist blog on this subject, which is titled Amid COVID-19, Iraq Remains a U.S.-Iran Battleground. And that post includes views by additional Atlantic Council experts on Iran and Iraq. With that, let me turn to Abbas to kick off our discussion. Each of our discussants will talk for not more than 5 minutes. Abbas, over to you.
Thank you, Will, and good afternoon, everyone. This is timely, and it is also very nice to figure out a way to meet with people, even though everybody is working from different settings than what we used to. So we welcome everyone, and hopefully we will provide something that remains useful as we have done in the past. There are three things that I want to focus on in the 5 minutes. So one of them is the government formation, which is the big question for Iraq right now. And this is item number one on everybody's mind. Then touch on the security issues and also the challenges ahead. Government formation, we all know as a background, Iraqi current prime minister has resigned in the beginning of November last year. And there has been a challenge in replacing him with a new prime minister and replacing the cabinet with a new one. The president, after a long time actually passing the constitutional mandate, finally designated a prime minister candidate, Mr. Mohammed Tawfiq Alawi. And according to the constitution, he had 30 days, but he could not manage a consensus to get his cabinet to be presented to the parliament, much less being confirmed. And the reason for that was that parliamentarians who opposed him basically used a tactic that prevented a vote by not showing up to the session and preventing a quorum. Now we have a new candidate, Mr. Adnan Zurfi, the former governor of Najaf, and he was also a deputy minister of interior for intelligence and currently is serving as a member of parliament since 2018. This is also, as it stands now, another uphill battle for the Iraqi political class to get a government and a cabinet confirmed. The problem is that there is a very little consensus among the Shia political parties, given the Iraqi quota or political apportionment system. The prime minister job is allocated to the Shia political parties, and there is a general understanding that any candidate to be successful must have a consensus among the various components of the Shia political class. So far, it has been very hard to get that because of differences of loyalties, differences of governance visions, and also the natural rivalries among Iraqi political groups. Each one of them views the prime minister job as a great opportunity for acquiring power, wealth, and other aspects of governance. So it is important to put that in perspective. Will Mr. Al-Zurfi form a cabinet? This is going to be a very hard question. He can easily get the votes if he grants the various political parties, both Shia and non-Shia, what they want of him. But then the question after that will remain, what will happen after the confirmation? And if he gives too much power and he gives too many positions to other parties, he will be completely defanged and will end up being without power, mostly probably will alienate his Shia base and will end up probably facing the fate of Prime Minister Adel Abdel Mahdi, who ruled without a strong backing in the parliament. So this is a very fine line that Mr. Azurfi has to walk and make sure that he gives the political parties the required perks and largesse to secure their votes, but he has to make sure that he maintains a semblance of legitimacy, and also he makes sure that he doesn't give too much power, that he ends up being a puppet prime minister. The security side of that, and we can talk about all of these issues in the question and answer. The security side, of course, is as well just mentioned. It is the rules of engagement in Iraq have changed in the since late December, and with several attacks and counter-attacks between Iraqi fighting forces, mostly backed by Iran or close to the Iranian policies. They attacked Iraqi bases that host United States troops. And of course, taking advantage of the fact that the government is weak and it is a caretaker government, not decisive in its actions, and also the chaos on the streets because of the protests that have been ongoing since October. This retaliation and counter-retaliation that has been going on in a seesaw struggle between the United States and its detractors in Iraq have made the complicated Iraq's position both domestically and internationally. The United States still does have a strong ability to deter groups that attack U.S. forces in Iraq, but not without a cost. The U.S. Is there at the invitation of the Iraqi government, and it is for an understanding that the U.S. forces are there to help the Iraqis combat ISIS, help build capacity for Iraqi security forces, maybe serve as a deterrence, excuse me, to any possible threats to security, Iraqi security from outside the country or domestic. But if the U.S. bombs various groups, no matter what the rationale might be, that will change the image of the United States from an ally to a force that is targeting Iraqis. Let's put it that way, especially with all of the cases in the past. We've seen some collateral damage, and we've seen some people who got caught in the bombings that were not intended to be killed. It is not an ideal position for the United States and its current posture in Iraq to be bombing inside Iraq, no matter what the rationale is. So that is a problem. Now, of course, the fighting groups that are targeting the United States forces that are interested in driving and determined to drive the United States forces out are aware of the ability of the United States to hurt them. So they are using some maneuvering, including rebranding. We've seen recently the formation of a new group of fighting forces called Usbat al-Tha'ireen. In their declaration, their announcement of the groups, they said that they are not new. They have been fighting in the past, which tells us basically who the identities are. It is the same militias that were fighting during the U.S. Invasion and its aftermath, since 2003, 2004, possibly until 2011. So we are talking about Kataib, Hezbollah, Asa'ib Ahl al-Haq, and Nujaba, and several other groups that are declaring every day that their goal is to drive the United States forces out. What is ahead for Iraq? I think we are going to have a challenging year, 2020. It is for everybody, looks like, in the world, but Iraq in particular. If we get a prime minister confirmed anytime soon, then the confirmation will be just the beginning of the troubles for the new prime minister. He will have to deal with all of the accumulation of shortcomings and problems of Iraq since 2003, maybe even before 2003, and also the added problems, the protests and their demands, and they are legitimate demands. The ceiling keeps rising by the day. Also, the problems of coronavirus, which is nobody knows how it will unfold in Iraq. Iraq does not have a healthcare system that has the ability to contain it. And we've seen even with countries like Italy, among the best healthcare systems in the world, it crippled the country. And we've seen even with China and others, Iraq does not even have any of that. And we don't know how the situation will unfold once we start seeing the developments here. And also to add insult to injury with Iraq situation is the decline in oil prices. More than 90% of Iraqi budget comes from oil. And right now, oil is on a trajectory to be not worth even getting from under the ground and selling it. And without that, Iraq will end up without any means of subsistence for most Iraqis. There are 6 million Iraqis who are on some form or another of a government check, either the employees or the pensioners. And it costs about $60 billion or so to pay the salaries for these people. If the barrel of oil goes into the 20s, Iraq's deficit will be somewhere in the vicinity of 40 or more than $40 billion. And there is no other way to substitute for that amount of money. So that could really cause a state collapse. And if you combine it with the corona outbreak pandemic, that would be a very tough situation for Iraq. Let me stop here, and if there are any questions, I will take them, and in the interest of time, for my colleagues to have their own views.
Thank you. We'll wait for the questions till after the opening statements of each person. We'll go to Barbara Slavin next.
Thank you. It's a little odd to be addressing you all this way, but let me begin by wishing a happy Nowruz to all of those trying to celebrate this year. It's obviously not the most auspicious beginning to a new year for those who celebrate. Let me just point out that Iran may turn out to be the country that is most affected by coronavirus per capita. It already has 20,000 reported cases, over 1,400 deaths, and there are some studies that indicate that figure could well go into the millions, and Iran is a country of only 80 million people. Turning to the subject today, I don't think Will Wexler, his timeline didn't actually begin where it should have. This crisis began when the Trump administration decided to quit the Iran nuclear deal in 2018, and then a year later impose what amounted to an oil embargo on Iran. That's when we began to see escalation in the region, and then particularly in Iraq starting around New Year's. It's been my view that, frankly, when the US made that decision to quit the Iran nuclear deal, it made its own continued presence in Iraq untenable. And I think the dilemma has only worsened with the assassination of Qasem Soleimani and Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes on Iraqi soil. The Iraqi parliament, as you may remember, voted to give the United States a peaceful way to withdraw its 5,000 troops from Iraq with a non-binding vote after the assassinations. But the Trump administration not only did not agree to renegotiate its presence in Iraq at the time, but actually threatened Iraq that it would cut off its access to its oil revenues in the New York Federal Reserve Bank. Not the best kind of thing to say if you're trying to encourage the Iraqi government to allow you to stay. Some other thoughts I think worth pointing out. Abbas Kadim pointed out that there is this new group that has emerged, but it reminds me a lot of the situation in Lebanon in the 1980s when, as you may remember, there were a lot of attacks on Americans, Americans being kidnapped by shadowy groups who had a variety of names. And in fact, they were all tied to Hezbollah, Lebanese Hezbollah, and through Hezbollah to Iran. It was just convenient to put forward these names, even though the real culprit was pretty obvious. So I think a U.S. exit from Iraq is inevitable if something doesn't change. How that exit takes place depends to a great extent on the overall U.S.-Iran relationship and whether the Trump administration is willing to alter its policy of so-called maximum pressure to allow for at least some sort of compassionate response to the coronavirus. A lot of people have been suggesting this now. Even the British government has suggested this, that the U.S. should pause its sanctions while Iran faces this terrible crisis. There is also, of course, the fact that Iran has asked for an emergency loan from the International Monetary Fund of $5 billion. One thing the United States could do to show that it does understand the kind of crisis that Iran is facing, it could allow that loan to go through because Iran is on the list of U.S. designated state sponsors of terror. The U.S. is in a position to block any international financing for Iran if it so chooses. So it would be an easy step, a real, in my view, no-brainer to simply allow this loan to go through. Secretary of State Pompeo and others keep saying that they care about ordinary Iranians, and this, again, would be a concrete step. There is one other area in which we might see some progress. The Iranians just yesterday released under medical furlough a U.S. Navy veteran named Mike White, who had been jailed in Mashhad for over a year. He has underlying health conditions. He's been released into the custody of the Swiss, who represent U.S. interests in Iran in the absence of diplomatic relations, and he will at least be able to get some kind of medical care and be out of prison where catching COVID-19 would be, unfortunately, a lot easier. There are other Americans who are still jailed in Iran. It would be fantastic if Iran used this opportunity to let these people go, and the United States allowed the IMF loan to go through and at least stopped adding on new sanctions. I should add that Secretary Pompeo announced more sanctions this week. Just an incredibly callous act at a time when Iran is facing these difficulties. Clearly, Iran has mismanaged the crisis. There are a number of things that they have done which are terrible from a public health point of view. But this is not the time for the United States or others to compound the problems in Iran. We have seen the E3, Britain, France, and Germany, and even Iran's regional rivals, the United Arab Emirates among them, come forward with assistance to Iran at this time. And I think that is what we should be trying to do, not exacerbating the situation in Iran or in Iraq. And with that, I will turn to my esteemed co-panelists and await your questions.
Thank you very much, Barbara. That was extremely helpful. Kirsten, let's go to you to talk about where the Trump administration is in all of this.
Great. Thanks so much. Thanks, Will. Thanks, Barbara. Thanks, the boss. And thanks for everyone who's on. Really looking forward to the Q&A and the discussion. What I'm going to walk through really quickly is what U.S. objectives are in Iran ground and what the debate this week has been within the administration. We can get into other topics like sanctions in the Q&A perhaps, but just in the interest of time. So U.S. objectives in Iraq, separate from Iran policy, are to bring the troops home, to reduce our footprint and reduce our resources allocated to this theater of war, to consolidate our CT gains, to maintain a partnership with the Iraqi security forces that enable interoperability in the future, to keep Iraqi energy flowing and increase the efficiency of this sector, and to create stabilization in the economy to an extent that it creates new markets for American companies. So that is what we're looking at, sort of an overarching view, and lots of different parts of government are working on each of these pieces, some with more success than others right now for obvious reasons, but just so you all have an understanding of the context in which a lot of these decisions are being made. So what has changed on the ground in the recent week or two in the U.S. government's view as we're seeing this uptick in escalation? One is the emergence of the new group that Abbas mentioned, and we can always talk more about, Barbara mentioned as well. Two is the recent proclamation by Kata'ib Hezbollah of the call for a jihad against Americans and against any Iraqis who support Americans. It's my understanding that both the CT service and the Iraqi security forces have said they are still with the partnership. But we did see the protective service, this is another change on the ground, that is charged with protecting American locations within Baghdad and a bit in the surrounding, leave their posts this week due to this, we believe, proclamation by Kata'ib Hezbollah and not wishing to be in the way and to be collateral damage in any attacks that Kata'ib Hezbollah will be planning and we know are planning, which brings us to the next point. U.S. intelligence believes, and they can speak openly about the generics of it, that most of the groups that are aligned with the IRGC, remember this is separate from Sadirist groups or those that actually do take direction from the government of Iraq, but those who are aligned with the IRGC are in fact planning additional and frequent attacks against all our bases and our embassy compound in the very, very near future, within days. And there's also the understanding that the attack on the 14th was conducted from property that is affiliated with Harakat al-Nujaba. So that's a new finding as well. What this does is help the military define who adversarial targets are when they go to draft their responses, when they go to draft what kind of retaliation or kinetic action might be necessary. It's important for them to know exactly which group is active because they do not want to act against a group that is not responsible for a particular strike and therefore inflame even further Iraqi popular opinion or signal to the group that did conduct the strike, if they in fact were not targeted, that the road is open for them to strike again. So that's what the military and the NSC and the State Department are juggling this week, is how to respond. As Abbas mentioned, one of the big reasons that there has not been a response, in addition to the coronavirus, which you can talk about it in Q&A if you'd like, is the emergence of this new prime ministerial nominee who is perceived to be more pro-American, or at least not anti-American, than predecessor nominees in this current transition period. So the US government would like to see this person successfully take the lead. And there was a debate within the government about whether or not responding quickly to the strikes this week would disable his ability to create a consensus that would allow him to take the helm. So in the interest of creating space for him to build a political coalition, the decision was made to sit quietly. And the only thing that's overlapping what I'm saying here with the piece that we wrote last night, my work in that was that we'd like to call on Iran to do the same and to allow the Iraqi government to have the political space to make their own decisions and to cease the violent conflict and not have these folks making decisions while rockets are flying over their head. And that's something that Europe and the Gulf can help with, because obviously the US is not in a position to put that ask in with the Iranian government. But if our partners and allies would ask them to quiet down their direction for proxies to act against the US and international troops and trainers on the ground, we might create some space for the Iraqis to decide things for themselves. So what has not been a change on the ground, so that people don't misread other signals? One is that there's a retrograde going on right now that was pre-planned. So some of the pulling back of forces from bases around outside of Baghdad was a planned retrograde. It's being accelerated, but this is not new, and this is not because of these rocket attacks. And our Iraqi counterparts will confirm the same. Also, the halt that's part of the halt in training because of the coronavirus mirrors the halt in training that we saw back in November when rocket attacks were escalated. So anytime there's a concern for safety of troops and trainers, training is going to pause. So that's what we're seeing now. Again, this time the threat being more distinctly coronavirus, even than the rocket attacks that, while undesirable, have not been horridly, I don't even know what the right adjective is there, but have been fatal on the lower ends of the numbers. Every person matters, but have not taken out an entire base or something like that. So what was the debate in the US government this week? After March 11th, we responded with an immediate strike against 5 Kata'ib Hezbollah logistics locations and weapons depots. We did not respond after March 14th because clearly this kind of measured strike was not a deterrent. So now the discussion is, do we do additional measured strikes on an additional set of logistics and such targets? Or is something a little stronger necessary? Or is something more creative necessary? And that's what is being discussed. So since this did not deter, U.S. options are rather limited. Locations of logistics hubs are finite, and sanctions have been fairly fully deployed. The U.S. knows that additional attacks are coming, so an option of no response is not an option. But the debate is over how significantly to respond, where and against whom, and which targets and in what time frame. And you saw this week with statements by Assistant Secretary Schenker and by Secretary Pompeo that the U.S. government is signaling room for the new prime ministerial designee to be able to constrain the use of violence by paramilitary forces. We know that's kind of a long-term or at least medium-term goal, but we definitely want to make it clear that we will stop on our side if space is given to him to exert command and control by the Iraqi government over these groups. In the administration's view, here's how the regime in Iran is taking advantage of the coronavirus in ways that are escalating this conflict right now. One, this virus, of course, understandably keeps protesters at home. This is nobody's doing. This is just a fact. But what this does is reduce visible anger with the regime, and it reduces international pressure on the regime, therefore, to change its behavior. The administration also feels that Iran is playing on international sympathies while at the same time attacking U.S., Iraqi, and coalition personnel in Iraq, hoping these attacks kind of fly under the radar or are not responded to with the significance that they deserve because of the pressure of the virus. And three, that the regime is asking for $5 billion in international financial relief in the guise of responding to the virus, but that they will, in fact, spend this money on proxies seeking to violently enforce their aims in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, the whole nine yards. I'll stop there because I think I'm at the end of my time, but I'm happy to answer questions on whether the administration would consider lifting sanctions in Q&A.
Thank you very much, Kirsten. I'm sure you're going to get a lot of questions. Tom, why don't we go to you to end this portion of our event today?
Thank you very much, Will. For all that life in the United States, Iraq, and Iran, and all around the world has changed because of COVID-19, it's absolutely astonishing that none of the policies that we've been discussed so far have taken account of this fact. Instead, what we're seeing is the governments of Iran and the United States each determined to try to apply maximum pressure to the other. In Iraq, there are many politicians who are trying to avoid fundamental reforms that many Iraqi protesters, and indeed those who did not take to the streets, really want to see the Iraqi government make. The result of the collision of the COVID-19 social, health, and economic consequences against these policies is one of the most striking aspects of this entire situation. What I'm concerned about is that we're seeing a crisis build up that could erupt over late this spring or summer and could be the story that drives COVID-19 off the front pages. First, let's look at Iran very quickly. As you've just heard from Barbara, they seem undeterred by the death of Qasem Soleimani. They no longer make a secret of their goal to try to drive the United States from the Middle East. This was tweeted out by Supreme Leader Khamenei and President Rouhani right after Soleimani's death. So that's an open fact of what Iran's goal is. They tried to get their supporters in the Iraqi parliament to back resolutions that would have the effect of driving the U.S. military out of Iraq, and that failed. So they've reverted now to the attacks by proxies, which have already killed Americans, and as you just heard from Kirsten, have the potential to target other U.S. bases or indeed the embassy. What would happen, however, if those attacks were to succeed is that President Trump would be compelled to retaliate with strikes, that if those strikes did not further deter Iranian action, and I see no reason based on what Iran's strategic goal is, why it should consider any U.S. strikes in Iraq as deterring it from pursuing its goals, the result will lead perhaps inevitably to strikes against Iranian home territory. Iran most strikingly shows no sign of wanting to reach an accommodation with either the United States or its Arab Gulf neighbors, and that's one of the most significant aspects of the crisis that we're not seeing. As we also heard, the United States seems unmoved by the humanitarian situation in Iran. to offer any serious gesture in response. You've heard of the additional sanctions that were imposed. Will mentioned the decision not to take attacks on targets in Iran by President Trump, which I don't think would have been seen as a charitable gesture. And it was noted that Brian Hook at a press briefing on March 19th said that the idea of offering sanctions relief during this crisis was, as he put it, a tired regime talking point. What I think we're seeing is signs that that the United States is seeing no sign of wanting to change its policy because it believes precisely that this kind of a crisis is one of the few things that would motivate a fundamental change in Iranian policy. Meanwhile, Iraq is locked in the efforts to try to appoint a new prime minister to replace caretaker Prime Minister Adel Abdul Mehdi. Adnan al-Zurfi is somebody who is well known in Washington as much as he is inside Iraq itself. He's a very colorful politician. His signature position is his opposition of the idea that Iranian-backed militias should be outside of the control of the Iraqi government. The militias, not surprisingly, are trying to block his nomination. Iran is in the position of not being able to get its own candidate into the premiership, but also being able to block someone who opposes its militias from taking up the position. And Iran therefore sees it as a continued opportunity to try to mount attacks in the hopes of forcing President Trump to make a humiliating withdrawal from Iraq. A lot of experts have come up with a lot of really good ideas, but the practical consequence of the positions that the countries have all entrenched themselves in seems to be that they're not going to take anyone's advice. I think this leaves us with trying to look at three possible ways out of this current crisis. And as you will see, several of them are truly horrible. Others are going to end up obviously leading one or more sides in positions of defeat or humiliation. So there are three ways out. I don't believe that there ever is such a thing as an accidental war, but a strike that would be considered lucky or unlucky by either Iran or the United States could alter the course of history by forcing one side or another's leaders to take actions that would lead to a war. Second, the situation has three potential exits on the calendar. The first, in terms of the way the United States sees it, is obviously the election on November 3rd. It's clear that a Democratic candidate, if elected, would have a fundamentally different approach to Iran. There may be some in Iran that are hoping for such a change. Ironically, they may end up being disappointed because they're not likely to get what they want. It's very clear, whoever the Democratic nominee is, that he's going to pursue American interests. And that may lead to efforts to try to resolve this through regional conferences and other kinds of negotiated outcomes. But it's hard to see any American president of any party taking sanctions and military force off the table, certainly not at the outset. Second, Supreme Leader Ali al-Khamenei is 80 years old, and natural causes could lead to a change in the Iranian leadership. And then finally, there will have to be some kind of Iraqi election. That's one of the functions of the current caretaker government or of any new government that might come in. And that could result in changes or a continuation of the status quo. But there's the possibility that a new nationalist coalition might emerge if there are the kind of fundamental changes that protesters and indeed millions of Iraqis would like to see made in the way their own politics works. And then finally, the last option is what is COVID-19's effect going to be on the social, economic, and indeed military fabric of the region? COVID-19 is one of these things that undermines the foundations of entire governments and government policies. This is one of those things where the edifice will look strong and intact up until the very end when it crumbles. All three of these governments, and indeed every government around the world, is now under a kind of stress that many of them have never experienced in the generation of officials who are now holding offices in those positions. And essentially, the unthinkable is now going to be thought of in many countries around the world. This may not produce an outcome that anyone is going to like. And it's therefore, I think, up to all of us to start thinking about some of these previously unthinkable consequences, because each of these fundamental policies that we've been discussing today in Iraq, in Iran, in the United States, could undergo radical change by factors beyond the control of those who hold office right now. So having set that up, we are very interested in your questions. I turn this back to Will.
Thank you very much, Tom. That was not entirely an optimistic set of views, but I think a very important set of views to understand. We're going to go first to Julian Barnes from the New York Times for the first question.
Hi, Julian here. Can you hear me? Hopefully you can.
We can hear you fine.
Great. So I want to ask Kirsten a little bit more to go into the pros and cons of reducing sanctions at this point. I mean, obviously it would be a humane gesture to a country that is suffering. On the other hand, does the Trump administration feel now is the time to sort of maximize the maximum pressure campaign and really drive the Iranians to the negotiating table? And what role does the continued sanctions program play in that strategy?
Sure. Thanks for the question. Happy to attack this. And I'll let Barbara perhaps speak to some of the pros that would come from reducing some sanctions, because she's more in touch with the ground there. Let me tell you how the administration perceives this and why we're not looking at a scenario right now where there would be any impetus for a reduction in sanctions. Several points. One, the perception that sanctions are working, that the protests proved that sanctions crippled the economy enough to cause the population to demand that the regime make different choices about how it spends money. So perception is they're working. Two, that no medical material has ever been sanctioned. And Barbara can speak to the argument regarding the banks on this on the other side of that discussion. But the feeling in the administration is if Iran says that banks are the problem, the solution is easy. Iran can agree to discuss their ballistic missile and proxy programs, and that they can't afford right now anyway. It should not be okay for them to ask their people to go without medical aid so they can continue these programs. The world should hold them accountable for this and ask them to make the only obvious choice, which is to come to the table ready to curb some of this. And it should be easy since they desperately need to reallocate this funding like any responsible government would do in the event of a health crisis. Third point that the administration is talking about with regard to this is that, right now there's not really an incentive to roll back sanctions. If you were the administration, where is that pressure coming from? There is no domestic pressure. This issue will not be part of re-election discussions. It will not weigh in to people's voting patterns, very likely. There is no meaningful international pressure right now. The Gulf certainly is not arguing for a rollback of sanctions behind closed doors right now. Other than, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar all want all sides to be happy, and the UAE is certainly helping with humanitarian assistance. But we do not see big requests coming in quietly to roll back sanctions. Europe does not have the leverage right now. They can ask for all the right humanitarian reasons, but there's no consequence for the US to ignore Europe if this becomes a stronger plea, to be just completely frank. And for instance, if you talk about the oil price war, Saudi has not asked for something like a rollback of sanctions in Iran in exchange for cutting oil production. I think that's fairly laughable. But, just to throw out all the potential places where there could be leverage, Russia and China don't care. Despite what they tell Iran, they do not have any desire to create pressure anywhere in the U.S. to force this issue. They frankly benefit. Russia benefits in China Russia benefits in Syria, and China benefits in terms of oil prices. So they're sort of quietly quietly enjoying the fact that sanctions are producing economic problems for Iran. And in lieu of sanction rollbacks, you would see offers of humanitarian aid like we saw previously, and like you saw another mention of this week by Secretary Pompeo and Schenker. Iran could choose to accept this, is what the administration will say. If it does not, out of the principle of maintaining its violent proxy programs and ballistic missile programs, and the regime has to answer to its people, but the US does not. So that's where the administration stands.
Yeah, can I just add something perhaps a little bit to it? I mean, if you look at the Twitter account of the Supreme Leader today, it's full of fire and brimstone and resistance. He's calling for a surge in production. He says sanctions have made us think about satisfying the needs of the country through domestic resources. This is valuable. So he's showing that he doesn't care what the United States does. He's also talking about how Iran has confronted many crises in the past and the Islamic Republic is still standing. So not very conciliatory messages coming there. I'm thinking more of a US gesture toward the Iranian people. It's, the US simply cannot claim it gives a damn about ordinary Iranians and not at least allow this IMF loan to go through, in my view. And how Iran chooses to use that money, well, as I think many people have pointed out, its support of these various partner forces in the region is very cheap. It doesn't cost them very much. And a lot of the ties that bind are ideological. They're not financial. These are not rent-a-crowds. These are not rent-a-militias. So I think at this time of international crisis, it behooves the United States as the world's greatest superpower to show more compassion and mercy. Although obviously after what Kirsten said, it's pretty clear we're not going to see that coming from the Trump administration.
Okay, thank you very much. We have another question here from Nora Mueller from the Korber Stiftung in Berlin. Nora?
Yeah. Okay, excellent. Thanks very much to a great panel. 2 questions from a European point of view. First question is how you assess Europe's efforts to help stabilize Iraq. This is one. And then the second question, which role could the Europeans play in Iraq in a post-US exit phase from the country? Thank you.
Well, European partnership with the United States is very important, and for Iraq also, it is very important. The Europeans don't do much in military operations, but they are good at stabilization. They generate good ideas for governance and many other issues. We just concluded our first round in the Track 2 dialogue, that is the US, Iraq, Europe Track 2 dialogue, and we were in Berlin for that dialogue between March 1st and March 5th. And there was a consensus that an American-European Iraqi partnership is very important, and it is going to help stabilize Iraq and put it on the right track in the long run. The other side of the question, of course, the United States' existence in Iraq is important for the Europeans because they provide the infrastructure, the protection, and many other needed logistics and help for the Europeans to operate in Iraq. And we saw that when the United States stands down, the European countries that partner with Iraq tend either to freeze their activities or to reduce them. So the US presence is very important, but there is a caveat to that. The US presence has to be accepted by the Iraqis. Recently, after December and January problems, and with more recent activities last week and the weeks before, we have seen that the United States forces have been busy mostly with force protection, and their posture is not as it used to be when they were fighting ISIS and partnering with Iraqis. And that is very important, I think, to consider, because if the US forces are there in Iraq without the acceptance and tolerance of Iraqi groups, whether it's the government and non-government, then they will not be in a position to facilitate what the Europeans need them to facilitate. And that is why I think the first order of things is to make an accepted and acceptable US presence in Iraq before we talk about the importance of that presence for the Iraqis and for the Europeans. How is that going to be done? I think there is no way around the fact that there should be a U.S. clear decision to take Iraqi concerns seriously, probably to negotiate and compromise on some of the stands. The U.S. can never succeed and win by having unwanted military presence in Iraq, and that is problematic. So I think there needs to be a lot of diplomatic work, and there needs to be less tweets and less public statements from Washington, and more work for the diplomats and behind closed doors with Iraqi diplomats, with other regional diplomats, in order to create that consensus. Bottom line, Iraq would need Western help. Europe, United States, and also anyone else in the world that can help Iraq. But that help has to be on Iraqi terms, and not on Western terms, and or at least some kind of mutually agreed terms. But so far, what we have seen is that the complaints of Iraqis, many of them in government and out of government, is that their terms are not being considered or respected. Everybody wants to go to Iraq and work on their own terms, as if Iraq doesn't, or Iraqi opinion doesn't matter. Any country that has dealt with colonialist era times, this complexity does not go away. It's an injurious memory for people who used to be in that position, and they do not want to be treated as colonized. They want to be treated as partners. The fact that Iraqis do need that help does not mean that they will have to compromise on sovereignty, to compromise on their preferences. This idea that you are either with us or with the other side, it's going to push Iraq to the other side, because, and I've said that many times, if the Iraqis are cornered to be chosen between being in the Western camp and being in the camp of very influential and important key regional actors, they might go to the key regional actors. And, the first comes in mind on the list is Iran.
We have a lot of questions. I think I want to go to Peter Galbraith next.
Well, I want to ask about we've had a discussion about the ambivalence in Arab Iraq, about the U.S. presence and whether it wants the continued presence or the influence of Iran. But there is one part of Iraq that is very pro-American, whose military forces were the only force standing up against the Islamic State in 2014. And therefore, the question is, if the U.S. is going to withdraw from Iraq, or the Arab Iraqis are going to want the U.S. to leave, should it maintain its relationship with the Kurdistan regional government and the Peshmerga, because that obviously is desired by the population and the government there?
Well, Ambassador, we both know that, first of all, it is not true that the Peshmerga were the only troops that stood against ISIS. It is, in fact, that nobody stood against ISIS in the beginning of the invasion of Mosul in 2014. The Peshmerga, like many other forces, did abandon key positions, including Sinjar, which caused one of the worst human catastrophes in Iraq's modern history. It was because they withdrew without firing a shot. They only were involved against ISIS after ISIS decided to attack the KRG and KRI areas. And that is when it happened. So basically, in the beginning, there was a failure on all sides of Iraqi forces, Peshmerga and the Iraqi forces, and various forces, as well as the local policing in the areas. And then everybody regrouped later, and then they began to act when they saw their interest in defeating ISIS. That's one thing that it has to be in the narrative, because it becomes really, important to set right. The second thing is, of course, it is important. As I said, Iraq cannot afford losing partnership with the United States. there is a lot of, and the US presence in Iraq is becoming a domestic issue. Many parties are trying to even sometimes use populist arguments for or against US presence. And that is, of course, not for the US sake or for Iraq's sake, but more about what they think is best getting them support among their constituencies. At the end of the day, to the other part of your question, which is very important as well, Kurdistan at the end of the day is part of Iraq, and US presence is an issue of international or bilateral relations. Kurdistan cannot make a side deal with the United States without Baghdad, and the US should not encourage them to do that, because the US presence is a sovereign thing according to the Iraqi constitution, and you've been very close to the writing of that constitution. I know it reserves all of the foreign relations for the federal government, like all other countries. So if there is any presence or if there is any kind of special relations between Kurdistan and Iraq, it should be through Baghdad, and it has to be through Baghdad. And Baghdad is highly encouraged and indeed strongly advised to have right relations with the United States, as Washington is also highly encouraged and advised to do the right thing in terms of getting good relations with Iraq. But it has to be through capital to capital, not U.S. to provinces. Otherwise, it will be a very dangerous way to. What hindered Iraqi progress most of the time is this idea that Iraq is being treated more than one Iraq in the practical sense on the ground. So it's very important, I think, for the sake of Iraq, for the sake of bilateral relations, that the U.S. does everything through Baghdad.
Thank you very much. I think we only have time for one more question. One thing that I've learned in the first virtual event that the Middle East team at the Atlantic Council has done while we're all on lockdown thanks to the coronavirus is that maybe we should make these events longer, because we have lots of questions in the queue that I wish we could get to. But for the final question, let's go to William Janis.
Yeah, thank you. Terrific presentation. Given all the moving parts that all the speakers spoke about, and China's footprint with Belt and Road Initiative in the area, the greater region of the East Mediterranean involving NATO allies as well, and in Afghanistan, do you see the opportunity for some type of a 19th century grand bargain, spheres of influence type of arrangement? And do you think there's any Metternich out there that could put this together? Thank you.
Who wants to take that? Any Metternichs out there?
I'm certainly not a Metternich, but in looking at the big picture on this, for all that there may be possible confrontation with China in economic and indeed East Asia Pacific areas, one of the things that has struck me and on a recent Atlantic Council trip to the Middle East to discuss counterterrorism cooperation, obviously the subject of China's role came up. It's absolutely not clear that there ever needs to be a Chinese-American conflict in the Middle East. This is precisely the kind of thing in which I would anticipate there's real hope for a kind of understanding, because China's economic interests and its political or security interests are not necessarily contradictory with the United States, because the United States is now an exporter of energy, and China is a huge importer of energy for the Middle East. There's not necessarily economic conflict that has to happen in the region. Certainly China's policies on things like human rights differ significantly from the traditional American view of those issues and the priority that should be given to human rights in the Middle East. But those sort of things aside, there ought to be a way of accommodating these in a way that assures both China its access to energy and economic markets, and ensures the United States both military security and economic relationships in the Gulf. So I really do, in contrast with some other areas, see actual hope for things working out in this area in the long run.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. we want to do two things here. First, there are some journalists on the line. If you have additional questions and want any of our experts to answer them for anything that you are writing, please email Stephanie directly, and we will engage with you appropriately. I also want to end with a quick 30-second round of all of our experts. If you have anything that we didn't get to, that you really want to let everyone know, now is the time. Let's start with you, Barbara.
Thanks. Well, on the China issue, China, of course, is the source of the virus, but it's also been providing a lot of assistance to Iran to deal with the virus. And I think the Trump administration's policies, quitting the Iran deal, sanctions, and now this, everything is pushing Iran more and more into the lap of China. And that is not in U.S. national interests. It's something that the Trump administration doesn't seem to care about. But I'm very concerned that even with a new administration in the United States, it may be very difficult to reverse that tendency in Tehran.
Thank you very much. Let's go to you, Tom, next.
I think what we're likely to see is going to be an effort by some to just try to maintain the status quo. I think that it may also behoove some of the governments in the Middle East to contemplate what role they may want to play in trying to see an overall reduction of tensions between the United States and Iran. This is one of those opportunities for Middle Eastern diplomacy to solve problems that the United States and Tehran probably are not in a position right now, for the reasons we discussed, to address them themselves. So I think that there are ways out of this crisis. I think the challenge is going to be doing so in a way that leads to a more constructive overall security relationship in the Middle East, and one that does a better job of taking account everyone's legitimate interests, but ensures that efforts like Iran's to undermine stability, that those efforts are brought to an end. So that's what I'm hoping we're going to see out of this, and I think some Middle Eastern countries can play a key role in making that happen.
Excellent. Abbas, final comment?
Well, thank you. That has been very helpful. I think the one thing that I would like to emphasize here is that we all have to watch the future development in the short term for Iraq. The government formation will settle many of the questions that are lingering in the minds of many people about Iran's influence. I think if this government passes, it will give a good indication that Iran has lost a lot of its influence, and mostly that would be attributed to the killing of General Qasem Soleimani. If the Iran and its friends manage to succeed in their effort to have Mr. Zurfi's government blocked, then you expect that the replacement of Mr. Soleimani is as effective as he is. This is a very important point. The other thing is I would watch the coronavirus unfolding and see how Iraq will go in that way, because I think that this is the most dangerous thing in Iraq, more than any other, it's more than the security, more than the other issues. And the reason I'm emphasizing that is because Iraqis are not showing enough seriousness in dealing with it, while we see many countries right now with empty streets, and we are all doing this in an alternative way. Iraqis are converging on Baghdad now by the hundreds of thousands to commemorate a religious pilgrimage that will jam hundreds of thousands of people in a very small area in crowded places. We saw some people defying all of the calls on holding collective and congregational prayers. If what we know about Corona is valid and the way it's spread, the way it behaves, then I don't know how Iraqis are thinking. It is suicidal what they are doing. And if that holds, means in 2 weeks, 3 weeks time, the incubation time of the virus, we are expecting horrible, terrifying levels of infections in the country. The biggest problem with Iraq is, we don't know exactly who is infected and who is not. The Minister of Health said out there that they are not equipped to even know any statistics and what is happening. So all what they know right now, and the only indication of the level of infections is how many people die. But they don't know, there is no testing, they don't know who is carrying the virus, who is not. And that is, I think, it's not just for Iraq, because that will be, right now we saw this is a pandemic. If Iraqis are infected by large numbers, others will too. So this is my closing thought here. It's not upbeat, but we're dealing with Iraq.
Absolutely. And Kirsten, your last thoughts, and then we'll close this.
With the purpose of explicating what the U.S. administration may be thinking, I just want to remind people that a U.S. red line was crossed again this week with the death of additional Americans. And what I think we should expect is a response perhaps stronger than we've seen in the past, since directed measured strikes were not an effective deterrent. In addition, I think we may be moving into an era of a new red line. And that is because the U.S. administration does not believe that Iran's conflict should be fought on the back of Iraqis. So the red line will be Iranian enablement of Iran-backed proxy groups active against American personnel in Iraq. And if it is evidenced when the U.S. retaliates specifically against groups in Iraq, that Iran is purposing them and enabling them and providing material and support to allow them to continue to launch attacks against U.S. in Iraq, we could see a stronger response from the U.S. aimed more at hitting that capability and aimed more at where the source of the problem lies. So I would just say to everyone here who is a diplomat, please get on the phone. Back channels are limited, and it's time to make sure that that red line is understood.
Well, on those happy notes, I'm going to say thank you very much for everyone who participated in this virtual event. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I learned a lot, and we'll be doing more of these in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.